So today we will take a look at how to sharpen bird images, which applies equally well to wildlife macros. And these are a few images that I got late at night or early morning today. And this is my regular collection from my today's rooftop session. And we'll use a few of these images to demonstrate. Don't worry about the red markings. That's for my next video. I'm just pulling out some images to demonstrate some concepts in the next one. But before we get into sharpening, a quick reminder that raw files always require tonal adjustments as also sharpening and noise reduction. This process is not optional for raw files. The JPEGs that you see or the preview that you see on the back panel of your camera is essentially the sensor data interpreted and rendered for display. The raw data itself will require sharpening, tonal adjustments. The camera only does whatever you've set in camera and renders the image. So this is not really an optional step. Simply put, sharpening is just another way of adding more contrast to an image. We have a variety of ways of doing that in Lightroom and Photoshop. While most people might consider noise reduction as just removing some noise, I would say it is also part of a contrast enhancement, to put it simply. Most of the sharpening happens at the edges that are detectable by the application software. Photoshop has a edge detection filter which works in a similar fashion, and you can see the same kind of lines. Essentially, it adds contrast, which makes the image look sharper. So today on my rooftop, I specifically took some images to better demonstrate the sharpening that is available to us in Lightroom. And like I said, before we get into that, keep in mind all of these are essentially going to add contrast to the image. It could be edge contrast, it could be color contrast. So let's just pick some image here, maybe this one, just for demonstration. As the first example, we will reset this so there is nothing applied. We go into the detail panel and we see Lightroom by default does apply some, which is good. What if this was not applied? You can clearly see that this is not an optional step. Now this was shot at ISO 1600 at a fairly high shutter speed, so we could actually get some color and luminance noise despite the light. So we set it back to the defaults. Noise reduction, there is no default in the luminance section. But if we look at the color noise, and we will take a look at another image which has a lot of it, watch what happens when I pull this to the right. Going between two extremes of any sliders will give you a far better idea. If you notice, you have this color difference. We can zoom in a bit more to see that clearly. And now you see these spots, the color variations, they will start to disappear. Similarly, if we pull the detail to the extreme, you can see the subtle change in this case. Look at the eye. This eye, if we pull up the details, look how it retains color and sharpens up. Similarly, if we look at the smoothing of the colors across the image, without any smoothing you have distinct gradations. If you keep smoothing it out, you will lose some contrast. Now this sharpening will essentially detect edges, and those edges will determine where the sharpening is actually applied, which is essentially edge contrast. Now almost all over in Lightroom, the Alt or Option key on the Mac will have a different function depending on the sliders that you're using. For example, if I just press the Option key here, you can see the labels change. If I just move this slider, you can see the grains coming out, getting more sharp. But if I press the Option key, Lightroom changes the image to black and white, which gives you a much cleaner idea as to how much sharpening to apply. Then the radius by default set to 1 determines the number of pixels that will be included in the contrast sharpening. If we reduce it, watch the image carefully. Look at the edges. For example here, and if we reduce it, the detail will try and pull out some more detail in the already sharpened image. If we push it high, you can see it's trying to enhance even the smallest pixels. Masking is important across any kind of image. The masking determines which areas sharpening and noise reduction will be applied. So what masking does, if we press the Option key and drag the mask, you can see it's mostly white till we start dragging it to the right. And this follows the same concept as in Photoshop. The whites that you see will be sharpened, the blacks will be left alone. So obviously we don't want these areas to be sharpened, only the edges and the subject. Now we come to noise reduction. This will almost always be required. So let's see what happens. Look at all these grains around. The color is consistent, but there is noise. So let's just pull this and see what happens. You can see it's getting smoother and smoother. If you push it to 100, you lose almost all detail. But the detail slider helps here. You can move this and start pulling out details even within the smoothing. The contrast also does the same in a different manner. If you pull it up, it'll start pulling out more contrast and edges out. You can see the patches coming up here. If we take it down, the patches disappear. So in a nutshell, this is what sharpening and noise reduction will do. Now let's take a look at other contrast tools. The tone curve, for example, if you pull it down, it'll add contrast. If you pull it up, you will lose contrast. So let's just reset this. In the basics panel, one, of course, you have the contrast labeled as such. The other area of contrast is blacks and whites. If you increase the whites, decrease the blacks, it's the same effect as pulling the contrast up. We'll just reset these. Texture is a very mild form of contrast again. You can see the difference. Clarity is a slightly stronger version. and slightly different behavior, but this is also contrast. And actually even dehaze is kind of contrast. If you look at it, it's a stronger version of the contrast than these two. So having gone into these details of contrast and noise reduction and stuff, let's just apply the preset, the wildlife preset. Now what the preset does is it applies a value on this panel that I found that works across most wildlife images, including macros. The luminance I set it to a 85 and the detail just under it, so we have enough smoothing and we don't lose details by default. So it works even for this image. So let's take a look at another image. Now this kite was kind enough to stay for a while, and I have used the highest native ISO on the D850. And we are zooming in now at 2:1 because that's the last zoom we did. And of course, Lightroom takes a while to load it up. We go into develop mode, zoom out, go into the basics panel first. Now if you look at, let me just change this to the file name. Right, so these are two continuous shots, but look at the white balance. Continuous shots, the variation in white balance is totally out of the world. This is another one, two continuous shots, and you can see the difference in the white balance. Now this is important to understand. The reason this is happening is because I left the white balance to auto in the camera. Had this been a JPEG, this would be gone. When we are shooting RAW, we have the option of reinterpreting the entire sensor data to create the image based on a newer white balance value, from where the whites and blacks and the colors shift. And we lose nothing in that operation, but only for RAW files. Ideally, if you can deal with it, I would recommend setting the white balance in camera to a fixed value, so metering does not have to work over time just for the white balance, which in the RAW you can always change. For example, this is as shot. You can do a auto where you let Lightroom decide. You can select daylight, flash, which is almost equivalent to daylight excepting for the tint, or set these values manually, or pick up the white balance tool and click places and see what comes out as being good enough. Okay, the white balance is important because that will affect everything, your sharpening, your contrast, everything. So once that is set, let's go back into the details for this one, do a reset. So this is what we get in camera at this insane ISO. Let's just remove this. So the first thing we'll try and do here is to make out the mask so that we only see the area selected. I've got the option key pressed, and that should be good enough. And then I'll try and remove some noise. I have the Alt or option key pressed. The color noise was apparent, and yes, we can still see that. So Maybe put this around the 80 mark. Could probably smooth this out a bit. Let's see how much we can sharpen this. Oops. Not a whole lot. Radius will help get some edges back. There's not a whole lot we can do with detail for this insane ISO. I don't think you would want to touch the contrast or details or any such thing here. Now let's see. Okay, this seems reasonably better. Let's just crop this out. There is a lot of shadow information, but again, you cannot do much with this kind of image excepting to demonstrate. So let's agree at 25K ISO does not work. And let's take a look at the before and after. Zoom in. So not really much to choose here. But since we have the basics at hand, let's go back into a macro image. What I will do is I will do a reset on this image and I will create a virtual copy of this. For the simple reason, if I want to look at the before and after, since I have imported this image with my preset, the before will always go back to that. So we go into the develop mode for this one. As you can see, this is shot with my 7500, and this was very early in the morning, around 3 a.m. So let's see what we can do with the details and sharpening in this one. So firstly, I would like to adjust the white balance because that will impact almost everything. Or okay, we just set it to flash because I had used the flash. At the same time, I'm gonna try and see how close it is to how one would view it. That seems good enough. So I'll just crop this out a bit, and so this is a mosquito on my desktop. I had the camera next to me and shot it without hurting it. So going back into the details, we zoom into a 2x level. The first thing I'd like to set is the mask, so we're not sharpening up stuff we don't need to. That seems to be good enough. Let's see where. Okay, just till about you start seeing some grain, stop right there. Okay, that seems to be more or less enough. The radius, and let's expand the area to a place where you can okay, and that should be good enough. As long as you have the alter option pressed, you will see that preview. And yes, we can definitely do some detail here. And I don't mind the noise because we still haven't gone into this luminance. That seems to be good. I could even do some contrast enhancement here. Color for a macro under flash. We can try pulling up some more detail. If you look at the eye of the mosquito, it'll keep popping out. So maybe around there. So this is what the image was, and this is where we can take it. So the wildlife preset that I have already shared works across all these images and gives you a far better starting point to fully develop your images. This is also contrast. If we pull it down, this is also more contrast. Look at how it pops up. This is even more contrast. This generally you would not touch, but it can be very useful only in very small amounts. And what the preset does, I will just duplicate here, and without touching anything else, you can see the difference between the before and the after. So this is what sharpening and noise reduction do, essentially adding more and more contrast, so the image really pops out. This is the before, this is the after. We'll get to more in the next one.